Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started here. Thank you for your patience. Particularly thank you for the patience of the people who are watching on Facebook live stream who thought we're starting at 2 o'clock. We are about to get started now. There are about 48 people watching on Facebook live stream. Sorry? Oh, 60 now. It's gone up. So people are watching at home or in the office. Good morning. I'm Andrea Barlow. I'm one of the principals with NES, local land planning firm, and I'm also the chair of the Public Policy Council for the Housing and Building Association, who are hosting this event. It's great to see so many people interested in this and this question of housing for all, which is becoming more extreme crisis, should we say, at the moment because of the attainability issues and shortage of housing supply, which we've all experienced, I think, and the increasing house prices. Thank you to our elected officials in the audience. If you'd like to stand and take a bow. We have some county commissioners, city council members. Hi, at the back there. Hello to everybody. Thank you for coming. And thank you to the business community, the various organizations who got together to sponsor this event. In particular, the Colorado Springs Chamber and EDC. Thank you, guys. We have the Pikes Peak Realtors. So, thank you. Didn't see any representatives, but now I see you. Apartment Association, hi there, and the Downtown Partnership. I did see those back there. Hello, and thank you to everybody who participated in putting on this event. And thank you to the county. Obviously, we are using their facility, so thank you for the participation in this event as well. And last but not least, thank you to everybody who's attending here today and listening online. We really appreciate everybody's interest in this subject and help us with answering some questions and discuss possible solutions and next steps that we can, as a community, help to implement to address some of these concerns. So with that, I am going to go on and talk about our program for today. So we have a couple of different aspects to this presentation today. First of all, we have Dr. Tatiana Bailey, our local economics guru, who many of you may have heard before. She will be talking about state and local statistics on housing, population, workforce, and other areas impacting attainable housing. That will be followed by the Common Sense Institute's 2021 Terry J. Stevenson Fellows, Evelyn Lim and Peter Lafari, who will be presenting details of their Conflict to Compassion Colorado Housing Development Blueprint for Transformational Change. So this report came out on Friday, and so we're very excited to be able to present the outcomes of that report to you with this forum. And with that, I am going to now ask Dr. Tatiana Bailey to come forward and do a presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. Actually, last time I was here, I was reluctantly presenting on affordable housing. I guess this is about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I had originally said no because it's not my area of expertise. But I was asked to do it, I think, because of the background information. Of course, the broader economy is a big part of what happens with affordable housing. So I'm actually looking forward to hearing from CSI and then hopefully having a good conversation. There's some great people in the room during the Q&A. So, quick show of hands. How many of you have seen me present in the last year on Zoom or whatever? Okay, this means I can move quickly through a lot of slides, okay? Even more quickly than usual. So here I always just like to acknowledge my sponsors for the UCCS Economic Forum. Without them, certainly this work wouldn't be possible. Okay. So, you know, COVID is hopefully behind us for the most part, not completely. Just a really, really quick update here. You can see that El Paso County and Colorado have both done better than the U.S. in terms of cases per 100,000. You can see the total number of cases in the text box. But things are plateauing, which is a really good thing, even though lately, of course, we're all hearing that some unvaccinated areas are starting to have, upticks due to the Delta variant, so we'll have to kind of keep an eye on that. And then new cases, which of course is prospectively telling us where we're going, are nice and low. And then here we have deaths per million. Colorado, again, did better than the rest of the nation. And then you can see the totals there in the text box. So really looking forward, I think most people, unless something unforeseen happens, are saying that we're not going to probably ever have, massive lockdowns again or anything. We're going to have to sort of keep an eye on these areas that don't have as high vaccination rates, and we might see pockets, right, across the United States that may have to do some of these limited lockdowns. You look at a country like India with a 4% vaccination rate, 18% with at least one dose. And this is where it kind of gets tricky from a public health perspective, because I think most of you know I have a public health background. There's this thing called selective pressure. And basically what that means is that as you kind of narrow in on the virus in one region, if it's proliferating in another region, that's where you start to get the variants, right? So really it's a race to get vaccinated across the globe. It's going to be super, super important. The exact timeline for boosters is not yet conclusive. We pretty much are sure that people that both had COVID and were vaccinated might have lifetime protection, which is super exciting. And just today in Science magazine, relatively small sample size, but the people with mRNA vaccines, which are most Americans, seem to have a much longer timeline for protection than some of the other vaccines, and that's super exciting too for us moving forward. Several years, potentially up to a lifetime. So maybe we're not going to be needing boosters as frequently as we thought. Now, the mRNA vaccines, which are the Pfizer and the Moderna, even for the variants that have shown up so far, the people who get it, who still get sick, the small, 5-6%, don't usually get as sick, so that's really good. The other thing that's really good news about the mRNA technology, and the last bullet that I have there, is simply that this technology has actually been around for about 20 years. Most people don't realize that. And because all of these global researchers around the world have said, oh, let's get working on this, it really accelerated the timeline for other diseases as well in terms of using the mRNA technology for things like cancer, high blood pressure, and so forth. So somewhat silver lining from this technology that's been around for a few years. Now, jumping into how this translates into the economy, well, yeah, we definitely had a big hit, much bigger than the Great Recession, but we're getting back to where we are, or where we were, okay? Not quite as if COVID didn't happen, but we're certainly heading in the right direction. Now, if you look at the forecasts in the text box, 6.7% is what the Colorado Office of State Planning and Budgeting is forecasting for the growth for the United States in 2021. Wells Fargo is a little bit higher at 7.3%. Now, I think it's important to also think about, well, how much did we actually lose? Yes, we're on the right path, but if you look at this, the economy had been growing at about 2.5% prior to COVID. If we had grown at the same rate through 2020, which of course we didn't, we'd be at 19.7 trillion, which is where that little star is on my graph. And basically that translates to 650 billion more in GDP than we currently are. Now, if you factor in the stimulus, at a minimum of 5 trillion, then altogether we're looking at about an overall hit, if you will, of 30%. So we have a lot of ground to make up, is basically the bottom line on that. Now, the Conference Board is another one that I look at. Is probably my favorite forecaster, just because it really looks at these different things that are in the bullets here. It's including building permits for new houses, and the Conference Board leading economic indicator, the blue line, correlates very well with the actual, which is the red line. And the Conference Board is actually saying that GDP will increase 6.6%, so very close to the Colorado projections, and they're saying that our next sort of big tranche of spending, of course, probably going to be in services, right, like travel and hospitality and so forth. A lot of this is also based on the fact that over half of Americans have received at least one dose. The savings rate is still elevated, 12.4%. I'll talk more about that in a second. It's gone up and down a lot based on when people get the stimulus checks. But generally speaking, it's still elevated, which means people have more money to spend. New monthly government checks to families with children are going to launch mid-next month. They are forecasting an inflation rate of 2.9% in 2021. We don't know exactly, when the Fed is going to increase, but as you all probably know, they moved up the timeline for that. There is a $2 trillion infrastructure plan with bipartisan committee support. All the Dems would need to basically sign up for that in order for it to happen. And that's not a sure thing. If it's going to happen at all, it's probably going to have to be through budget reconciliation, which means a lot of concessions. And then they also are saying that consumer spending is going to be up about 8% in 2021, residential investment up 16%. That's one of the biggest components. Non-residential, which took a pretty hard hit in 2020, up almost 9%. An unemployment rate of about 5.5%. But I'm going to talk quite a bit about this because you have to juxtapose that to the labor participation rate. A lot of people have left the labor force, as we all know. Inflation, they're also saying about same amount, 2.8%. I don't agree with this. I think it's going to be a little bit higher than that. And then, kind of tapering down after that. Now, before I leave this GDP section, I think it's always important to kind of step back. A lot of issues with China in the last couple of years. There's a lot of discussion about this when I was in graduate school. Technology theft, all kinds of different things. But whether we like it or not, they have about a third of the world's population. And if you combine them with India, it's about half of the world's population. We are 4.5 of the world's population. So whether we like it or not, we've got to figure out a way to do things in a fair manner. But also, we're going to have to play in the sandbox together. There's no question. And then if you look at this, international economists don't look at dollars, they look at purchasing power parity, which is basically sort of the buying potential of people. It's kind of like apples to apples, dollars, if you will. And if you look at it for 2019, the latest year that's available, China is actually has higher output and purchasing power than we do. And then the United States is second and so forth. And then in 2019, the debt levels were about 100% of our GDP, so very high debt levels. But then by June of 2021, we were at 28 trillion, so we're over 100%. Now, normally, what economists would say is, look, if you can get your growth rate higher than your expenditure rate, you can start to close that chasm. And we did actually see that during the Clinton years, where we still had a lot of growth, a lot of increases in labor participation and so forth. But when you have declining population for working ages and you have a higher dependency ratio, these debt levels can be problematic. So, there's a little bit of disagreement on that for economists, but that's how I see it. And then in terms of consumer sentiment, this is big because this determines how much people are wanting to buy and willing to buy and so forth. It is lower, but it's starting to trend back up, so that's a good thing. Vehicle sales is another thing I look at, a lot of volatility in that, but the recent decline in vehicle sales is mostly just because of availability, right? Because of the chip shortages and so forth. I think this is really interesting. I just started a series on sort of post-COVID long-term changes. On Sunday, the first one came out on work from home. Future of transportation is another one that I'm going to be doing. This is interesting. Tesla kind of stands out. The valuation has increased 700%. You can say maybe they're overvalued, but the reality is they've been a huge disruptor, right? And they have accelerated the pace of electric vehicles and hybrid. So if you look at this, Tesla is now larger than the next five largest global auto companies combined. But interestingly, the other sort of big disruptors are two Chinese companies. They're, I think, number 4 and number 5 up here. So you can see that the pace at which this is happening now, electrification of vehicles, is much greater. And then here you can see basically the bottom line on this is EVs are only about 3% of the total market right now, but it's going to be about 33% by 2030. It's a lot of change in a short period of time, and most of that's going to be in the developed world because charging stations are so expensive and most developing countries can't afford that. So I mentioned that already. Now, the personal savings rate is another one that's been really volatile. If you look at the top one, up, down, kind of based on transfer payments that have been made. Now, I think it's kind of interesting, now we're looking at roughly 1.5 trillion in quote excess savings, which is good for consumption moving forward. But then the bottom right, it's very hard to find this data, so this is a little bit dated. But if you look at that, the top 1% has a savings rate of about 40%. And then, the next 10% is at about 10%. But then everybody else, the 90%, rest of the 90% in the United States, is at about 0 to 1% savings rate, right? So that's where we start talking about affordability and, some people, really struggling, especially when they have something like this hit. Now, some of that savings is obviously, being used to pay off debt, which is a good thing because look at the delinquency on consumer loans. But also remember that people who don't have good credit don't get loans. So we have to keep that in mind as well. And there it is as well for all loans, not just consumer loans. Small business optimism, here you can see a lot of volatility there as well in this past year. I'm not going to go into a great level of detail here, but I want to highlight that 27% of businesses plan to create new jobs. That's really positive if they can find the workers. 34% of respondents say they have increased their compensation. That's a lot of the reason that I'm saying that I think inflation is going to be a bigger issue than what a lot of economists are projecting. Almost 50% of owners could not fill job openings. That's a record high, by the way. 93% of those said that they have no qualified applicants for these open positions. And 40% have openings for skilled workers, 27% for unskilled. Okay, so it's across the spectrum. Now, interest rates, of course, another important thing, rock bottom, a lot of speculation on when they're going to increase, but it's all relative, right? Prior to the Great Recession, the average Fed funds rate was 6.6%. And then here you can see the comparable prime 30-year and Fed funds rate. And, all the forecasts are saying that, certainly 2021 is going to stay the same. Probably 2022. Maybe by late next year, we'll see some increases in interest rates. And then the consumer price index, you can see the Western region is a lot higher than the US. The little green bar that I have up there is for the Denver, Boulder, Greeley. Really getting very close to the rest of the Western region, which of course is skewed by California. Now, is inflation a threat? That's a big question. Well, despite high unemployment, we continue to have a shortage of qualified labor. I think the competition for skilled labor in particular is going to be really fierce. It was bad before the pandemic, and it's just worse now. And it's the highest cost input for most businesses, right? So it's ubiquitous. And then on top of that, if you put high oil prices, which petroleum products are also ubiquitous, they're in almost everything, you have a confluence, right? Very slow reentry. So the longer people are unemployed, the harder it is to get them to get back into the labor force. Permanent shift in lower female labor participation rate and lower birth rate for two of the largest economies, the US and China. That's definitely an issue as well. Finely tuned supply chains. Well, they were finely tuned, and now everything's different because preferences have changed. But also, a lot of suppliers have just had to reshuffle things, who they're getting their goods from and how they're getting them. Another thing that's supply disruptions. There are a lot of countries, it's going to be a long time before they're fully vaccinated. So if you used to get your goods from one of those countries, it's not going to let up anytime soon. Of course, there's going to be this demand surge during the summer, which thankfully we're starting to see. There's the printing of money and the high debt that we talked about. We do have a pretty good startup rate right now. Often recessions make new businesses happen, which is a great thing. But in the meanwhile, there are a lot of dead businesses, right? So the businesses that have survived can charge more, and in fact, often they have to because of these other things that we're talking about. And then history also shows that if people expect higher prices, they often buy in advance. And that can also, exacerbate inflation. So it's almost a little bit of a hoarding impact. And then here, also from University of Michigan, look at the percentage of people that think the prices are going to be higher during the next year. So inflation can sort of beget more inflation. Then we have the S&P 500. Of course, I'm going to have to change my chart pretty soon, right? It keeps going off the charts there. And then, are we going to have a market correction? I'd be pretty surprised if we didn't. May not happen until 2022 when there's a hit on interest rates. But here you can see it. I think it's going to be bumpy. It almost always happens when you have a lot of disruption. The low interest rates have kind of caused a lot of zombie companies, ones that are just kind of getting by on these skinny loans. And some other issues. But I think one of the things to kind of focus on is, okay, once all the dust settles from COVID, what's kind of left? Affordable housing is definitely one of them, but I think it's my sixth bullet there. The structural issues are still going to be there, right? The skills gap, which we talked about, income inequality, and I have an article that I wrote on that came out January 1st, I think it was, of this year, if you wanted to look that up, looking at the data in a whole bunch of different ways. We have an aging population. We have the most expensive healthcare system. We don't really have the greatest educational outcomes, at least it's not uniform. Our kids have access to good education, but not everybody does in the United States. Too many transfer payments, for the elderly and disabled and so forth, and low labor participation rates. Wow, I'm depressing, aren't I, right now? It does get better, especially the local stuff. And then of course, starting 2022, there's just going to be no more stimulus. So that sort of pumping into the economy is going to be gone, and that'll be important too. And that's a lot of the reason I'm actually an advocate for some of these longer-term bills, like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is, by the way, more than just sort of traditional infrastructure, right? And even housing is a part of that. Okay, and then employment. Here you can see the unemployment rate is now 5.5%, not seasonally adjusted for May. That's about where the forecast is for this year, according to Office of State Planning and Budgeting. Most of the people who are unemployed are younger people, okay, but and that's 34 and younger. The unemployment claims, they're still pretty elevated. You can see here. The one thing I want to focus on is in the middle, you can see the civilian participation rate in just before the pandemic was 63.3%, which, by the way, was kind of low already in the United States, and now we're at 61.6. That's millions of people, over 3 million people. And then here you can see, I think I got rid of that other slide. Sorry about that. Okay, and then here you can see, though, that the percentage of jobs that we've regained in the United States at the bottom right is about 75%. In Colorado, it's about 84%. And here's the good news that I'll talk a little more about in a minute. In Colorado Springs, we've regained all of our lost jobs, which is really unusual. And then here you can see a little more about the civilian participation rate in red. If we include the people who haven't looked for a job maybe in the past year, but they still want to be employed, or they're working part-time, but they wish they were working full-time and so forth, that unemployment rate would be 9.7%, which is a big improvement over just a few months ago, but that's still pretty elevated. And then you can see that the declines have been across all age groups. And as I mentioned, 3.6 million fewer participants in the workforce now as opposed to pre-pandemic. And unfortunately, the forecasts from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the labor participation rate are not much better. I'm looking at Renee Zentz right now because she's actually, been in the room a lot with me in prior to COVID, even just in terms of talking of labor shortages in the construction industry. And you look at it, it's really across probably most industries, and it's for a host of different reasons. That's a whole other presentation. I was kind of curious about this, looking at having lived in Canada and the UK that have more generous unemployment benefits, if their labor participation was any better or worse. And actually, as it turns out, it's better than ours. So it's a complex issue. It's a lot more than unemployment insurance payments. And then job openings, of course, they're incredibly elevated right now because the economy is reopening. But that's a lot of openings, 9.3 million job openings. And that's roughly how many people are still claiming some type of unemployment benefit, which is interesting. Now, a little bit of housing. Real estate, if you include all the different components, makes up between 12 and 15% of GDP. And here you can see that the average and median prices have more than recovered from the Great Recession. And these are the values at the end of 2020. And then in the text box for May 2021, you can see the average and median. And of course, you know, that's for a host of different reasons that I'll talk more about in a minute. 99% of cities in the US showed gains in prices, mostly because of low mortgage rates and depleted housing inventory. 90% had double-digit growth. So the issues that we're seeing here are certainly not specific to just Colorado or Colorado Springs. And this is as of the end of Q1 of this year. 98% of condo prices also showed gains. And then here you can see the median price for a single-family home in Q1 was $319,000, up 16.2%, comparing Q1 to Q1. Median condo price was almost $278,000. And then here, this is just showing the year-over-year increase for each of these months in the past year. Look at May 2021. Again, kind of off the charts. And now, because of rising prices, you can see that a lot more people are saying now is a bad time to buy, and fewer people are saying it's a good time to buy. And then I'll talk more about our local housing market in a few minutes, but just by way of comparison, I wanted to show, you know, how as recently as 2007, 2008, Colorado Springs median home price was a lot lower than the U.S., and look at how it's kind of taken off. And this is as of the end of 2020. Now it's even more obvious. But now we're 20% above the U.S. home price. Total inventory in May was down almost 21% from a year ago. Supply was 2.5 months. Days on market was 17 days. 90% of the homes sold were on market for less than a month, so obviously going quickly. 31% were first-time home buyers. Sales have increased from a year ago, which we would expect. Lawrence Yun from the National Association of Realtors is saying he's expecting supply to improve, which it probably will somewhat, but it's, the first time I saw an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, that said, there's a shortage of about 3.5 million homes in terms going back to the Great Recession, all those companies that went out of business or downsized or whatever the case may be. Then I saw another article, good study, that said, 4.2 million. The latest one I saw said we have a shortage of 5.5 million homes. And, we can't build fast enough to make up that chasm. And I think that study said it would take about 10 years of really aggressive building. And then, why? Well, I guess I'm preaching to the choir, but basically, low interest rates. Some renters who feel very secure are tipped over by those low interest rates to become first-time home buyers. Here, the little table shows the impact of low interest rates. Basically, makes the difference between a $315,000 and a $400,000 loan. At 3%, your monthly payment is about $1,700, which is about the same as 5%. So you can see where you can afford a more expensive home because the interest rate is lower, right? And that's what the green numbers are showing. Same thing for a $500,000 home at 3% versus a $400,000 home at 5%. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. And then preferences, of course, shifting, more time at home and so forth. And then peak millennials were born in 1991. They're 30 this year. That's a big thing as well, right? Now, even though, let's look first at the little table at the bottom. Most of the homes sold in the United States are in that range of 100 to 500,000, right? That's the highest percentages. But if you look at the percentage change in sales from a year ago, the biggest increases have been in the more expensive homes. And, well, that's what the builders like to build, but also the people who have money really have money. And they are able to, to purchase these more expensive homes. And that, of course, spills over into affordability as well. And then here you can see new single-family home sales declining a little bit. And, permits and starts, skyrocketing, but now leveling off or even declining a little bit. Material costs, labor costs, availability, and then of course, prices just kind of going through the roof. And this is all for the US. And then here you can see the National Association of Home Builders has several things like traffic of prospective buyers and so forth. And this, kind of backs up that data of things leveling off a bit, although not falling off a cliff by any stretch of the imagination, just moderating. Now, affordability, and this is for new homes, you can see that the median sale price has continued to increase, and this is going back to 2012, but the Housing Opportunity Index, which is the percentage of people who can afford the median priced home who earn the median income, okay? So this is like a very sort of median look at affordability, has been declining, not precipitously, but surely, right? And then the delinquency rate, this is one delinquency rate that's actually ticked up a little bit. And this is in the context of moratoriums. Now remember that the foreclosure moratorium ends at the end of this month, so in a couple of days, and the eviction rental moratorium ends at the end of next month. Some states are bridging that to let it go out a little bit longer. But here you can see, it's kind of a big question. Are we going to see more foreclosures after this moratorium ends? It still remains to be seen. And then here, and I don't know if you guys are going to go into this at all, but about 6 million borrowers actually took advantage of the forbearance that was made available through the CARES Act. Only about 2 million of those are still in part of that program, okay? And a substantial share of these people who were eligible, though, never really participated. So the 2 million that we're looking at now is probably just a small portion of the people who are in some type of a distressed situation. And then the pie chart just shows for these people who are part of the program, what percentage of them are earning less, working fewer hours, percentage the same, and so forth. And here you can see, for instance, 39% say that their income is less than before the pandemic because they're working fewer hours. And that might be hospitality related and so forth. And I am making these slides available so you can look at the detail if you would like. Now, some states are strategically going to invest the $10 billion that's available through the Homeowners Assistance Fund to make refinancing more accessible. And I don't know if that's something that maybe the Common Sense Institute is going to be talking about. So what's coming down the pipeline? Well, savings are going to be depleted for a low-income group. And it's interesting because, they have a higher marginal propensity to consume, so they tend to be more savers, whereas higher-income people are more investors. So in terms of just kind of keeping the economy going, the lower-income groups are really important just in terms of their consumption levels. A lot of cities and states are bracing for higher levels of evictions and foreclosures, as we don't know exactly where that's going to land. Probably price increases for restaurants, cinemas, air travel, and so forth for a host of different reasons, mostly due to labor costs. I think there's going to be more emphasis on buying local for a host of reasons, but a lot of it is also going to be availability, again, because of the global impact of COVID. Definitely more work from home. I'll show you a slide on that in a minute, but it seems like it's going to be a preference that is here to stay to some extent. We don't know yet what that's going to mean for transportation. It still seems that public transit is not picking up at the level that it was pre-COVID, even in cities that had reopened a while ago. And then, most households are going to have higher health insurance costs. I don't know that there's any way around that. For businesses, probably less corporate travel, but I don't think that's going to fall off a cliff either. Commercial real estate's going to struggle a little bit, particularly office space, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Businesses are going to be mandated for insurance reasons, for more disaster planning. Employer health insurance and unemployment insurance costs are going to increase. There's no way around that. Record number of new businesses, I mentioned that before, and I think demographics are going to play a larger role in this labor shortage moving forward, even once COVID is way behind us. And then government, there's no question we're going to be, emphasizing public health a lot more. Probably more attention to climate change and investments in alternative energy because we have a Democratic administration. But it seems like it's probably going to be part of an infrastructure plan moving forward if it passes. Increased supply of government debt and more bonds issued. I think there's going to be more pressure on this whole thing of the income inequality. I know that crosses over to political, but because of what we're seeing now with the labor market in particular, I think there's going to be a lot more conversation and probably some legislation, continued legislation on that end. Maybe a little more bipartisanship. This is my optimism for today. And like I said, I want the long-term investments to elongate the positive aspects of the federal stimulus. Now, just a few slides on the Colorado state economy. The red line is us, the state of Colorado. We've been outperforming the US for quite a while. The forecasts in the text box, with Colorado Office of State Planning and Budgeting, I'm actually forecasting that we're going to have GDP, basically gross state product, GDP for the state, at 7.2%, whereas the state is saying 6.7% for the nation. Here you can see we did less bad in 2020. We fell only 1.5%, whereas the US decline was 3.5%. But if you look at more recent data, look at how we're doing now. Dark is good. We increased 7.9% in that time period, whereas the US increased 6.4%. 33% increase in new business filings, which is very exciting. A lot of them seem to be COVID-related new businesses. And then if we look at unemployment, you can see that our unemployment rate's a little bit higher. This is the teacher in me. Any idea why? Like, how can Colorado be doing better, but our unemployment rate's a little bit higher? Pardon? Higher labor participation rates. We have more people who are who are participating in the labor force. They're actively looking for work, and this is a huge advantage. And that's part of the reason that I am saying that basically Colorado is going to outperform the nation again by the end of this year. Here you can see that Colorado continuing claims are still elevated if we include everything, but here you have it. Civilian participation rates in the upper left. We were at 68.6 pre-COVID, went down, but look at where we are now, 68.2. We're getting really close back to where we were. Not true for the United States, we're better. And then if you compare these claims to what it was at the height of the Great Recession, that's the actually just a little bit above, it's not showing here, but a little bit above that dotted line. But if you look at 2019 weekly average, look at how low the claims were in 2019 compared to where they are now. So just to give you some indication. And then just the Colorado state portion of expenditures in the upper right hand, $3 billion. And if you include the federal, it's much higher than that. And here's a pictorial representation of the labor participation rate. And then here's what I showed you earlier in terms of jobs regained. And just as a quick reminder, the state of Colorado is at 84%. The US has 1.1 workers available for every job opening. Colorado has only 0.77. Okay, and again, it's because we have more people participating in the labor force. Colorado Springs, even lower, 0.68. And then here you can see how we compare at that 0.68 in Colorado Springs to other MSAs in our region. We're really doing, I guess you could say, quite well. I mean, we have a lot of people participating, but if you're a business owner, this is tough, right? because you can't really find the workers that you need. Now, we need more working age people. Certainly in Colorado, but definitely this is an issue across the United States. I don't know how many of you have seen the whole thing of declining population growth rates in the United States. Well, let me just tell you, replacement fertility is 2.1. So basically every woman has to have 2.1 babies on average in order for us to just replace ourselves, right? In 2020, we were down to 1.6. And this was happening pre-COVID. And there are huge implications from a labor perspective, competitiveness perspective. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on. You have more aging people than you have working age people. How do you pay for Medicare and so forth? 2020 was also the first year that we had a negative growth rate for population ages 20 to 64, which of course are your working age populations. I did my share. I would just like to put here. And that's 2006, my family. And I figure that at least 2 out of my 5 children will be productive members of society. So we hope. Maybe 3. All right. Now, this just came out today, and I think this is actually really cool. I know immigration is, kind of a political issue. I don't care. I'm an economist. If we need workers, I want workers. Let's create great pathways for people to be able to work here legally. So, the governor just announced that he signed a bill saying this new, I think it's called the New Americans Refugee Integration Act. I can't remember exactly what it's called. Rachel probably knows. But it's basically making it easier for the state of Colorado to bring in workers. Fantastic. That'll be a huge comparative advantage for us moving forward, because I don't think every state's going to be doing this. And then just so you know, in context, what is the employment? Who are the big employers? What industries? Well, healthcare and social assistance, because we're an aging population, and this is true for the U.S. Retail, trade, professional and technical services, accommodation and food, and so forth. Construction at almost 7% because of the growth here. But all of the nice thing is that there are a lot of them. It's not that we are dominated by just 1 or 2 industries in terms of employment. And then if you look at the projections moving forward, you can see here are the ones that are projected in the next, basically year now, to grow the most for the state of Colorado. And you can see that it's, construction is definitely included in there as well. And then in terms of demographics, we will have about 8 million people in the state of Colorado by 2050. The state demographer's office has revised down the population growth for the state of Colorado. Not that it's falling off a cliff, just not growing as quickly. And some of that is COVID related. Personally, a lot of it is driven by Denver, but I think we are actually going to continue to see the rates of increase and probably even benefit from some of the decreases that Denver is seeing. You can see there, 2021, if you look at the bottom, that's sort of the hit that the state demographer's office is projecting due to COVID. I didn't know this until I was talking with our state demographer, Elizabeth Garner, that a lot of our in-migration has been international in the state of Colorado. And that was actually started falling during the Trump years, and then COVID was just kind of another hit on top of that. And then here you can see that U.S. population is, as I said, was declining pre-COVID. The Colorado population had the slowest growth since 2005. Deaths also increased a bit more because of the COVID-related deaths, but also aging in general. And, if going back to, sort of my projections of Colorado Springs growing more, if you look at the rate of increase for prices of homes, our rate of increase is a lot faster than the Denver Boulder area, and that also kind of validates to me that our continued growth. And then we are going to be more, El Paso County will be a more populated county than Denver County by 2024. And then there you have the sort of hot counties. And then here are the hot spots across the United States in terms of population change from 2010 to 2019, and you can definitely see the Front Range, easy peasy. Now, this is another thing. Colorado for a long time been becoming more diverse, and I think something to really pay attention to here is racial ethnic minorities are a big part of Colorado's future workforce. So we have to make sure they have access to education and training. Has to be attainable. But we don't spend as much in K-12 as other states, which is kind of interesting. And we also don't provide as much state funding for higher education in the state of Colorado. People who go to public institutions in our state have to pay a larger proportion of tuition, as you can see there, 68% versus the US at 44%. So I mentioned this in my annual presentation. 50% of university level students don't graduate in 6 years. If they don't do it by 6 years, it's very unlikely to happen at that point. So that's an issue, right? Harvard's endowment is about $41 billion, about the GDP of Paraguay, as an example. 74,000 in tuition, 5% acceptance rate, very elitist. U of M's is $13 billion, just where I went to school, just saying. 4 times the endowment of Michigan State University. So what if some of these large endowment institutions built training centers, 1-year boot camps, 2-year, community college type certifications, or 4-year in low-income, neighborhoods? I mean, there are all kinds of, different things that could be done. But the bottom line is higher education is becoming more and more elitist in this country, and it's not going to work. It's just not going to work for long-term sustainable growth. And I don't even think it always, of course, has to be university level, right? It can be, and a lot of kids are deciding not to do university level because of the debt levels. And then just for real estate, we are one of the most expensive states. The 2021 data isn't out yet, but you can see that here. Colorado kind of stands out. We're definitely, getting up there in terms of median home prices. This was just a study that said, hey, if price increase in Denver, if they continue in the next 10 years like they have in the last 10 years, we're going to be the 4th most expensive state. And I won't go into detail here, but the average home price for Metro Denver will be about $1 million. They said Colorado Springs will be about $564. This study isn't that old. We're almost there now. So it's certainly not going to take us 10 years. And then if you look at single-family permitting, really it's been growing along the entire Rocky Mountain region. Multifamily permitting as well. And then this is just, how much do you need to earn to afford a modest apartment in 2020? In Colorado, we were the 8th, highest state for that metric at $26 an hour to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. At that rate, it would take 71 hours a week on the average wage of a renter. So, and here's an infographic. You could look up more of this in the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And then lastly, our local economy. Here you can see, the blue line is where I'm projecting we're going to be, pretty much along the same lines as the state. So outperforming the nation, maybe a little bit lower than the state, but certainly doing quite well. And then if you compare Colorado Springs to the other MSAs in 2019, we did outperform. This data lags a lot, so we'll have to wait and see how 2020 looks. And then here it is compared to other MSAs within our state. Again, we did really well. And then again, these are the areas of the United States that performed really well in 2019. Again, the Front Range. And then, what are our big sectors from an output perspective? Well, in Colorado Springs, the first one is actually real estate, insurance, finance. That's our biggest contributor to gross metropolitan product. Then professional and business services, then military, and so forth. And then here, I just want to highlight that if we compare these contributors to the United States, we actually outperform in several metrics, Colorado Springs MSA, including finance and insurance, but also professional and business services. And that sector continues to increase. And then, of course, military is a big difference as well. And, you can take your time looking at the other ones. And then I'd like to look also at sort of what is confidence. We don't have a University of Michigan confidence by city, but if you look at vehicles, they've been kind of up and down, but luxury vehicles in the text box are up 16%. And that basically tells me that you still have a lot of people buying expensive goods in our city. And then sales and use tax, I mean, we all thought we were going to have a terrible hit on sales and use tax, and it didn't materialize. It was basically flat in 2020, and now we're starting to see some nice increases. If we look at employment, our unemployment rate is about the same as the state of Colorado. We're at 5.8% in May versus 5.7%. I'm forecasting for us to be at about that level for the rest of this year. And if you look at us in terms of number of employed people, May year over year, we've had really nice increases. That's part of the jobs regained that I showed you earlier. And then in terms of unemployment rates, as I said, we're a teeny bit higher, but basically in line with our state and our nation. And then what are the big sectors in terms of employment in our region? Well, healthcare, just like the US and Colorado. Retail trade is a big one, and this is again by employment, right? So number of employees. Professional and technical is really big, almost the same as accommodation and food and education, construction, and so forth. And then what are our super sectors? Well, I looked at this more recently. You can see that these are all the sectors that have been increasing. Many, in fact all, I think took a hit during COVID, but are rebounding nicely. And then if I look at the past several years in the text box, these are sort of what I call our super sectors. These are the ones that have had the most increase. Construction is number one. And then here are the ones that are projected to have the most increase. And again, construction is on there, but also healthcare, social assistance, and professional and technical. And then here, this QCEW data lags a little bit, so we don't have the most recent, but here you can see, big hit. We lost about 8,000 jobs in 2020. But with the job postings that we have and the percentage regained that we've seen so far, I'm hoping we're going to get at least back to baseline, because you can see we've been doing really well since 2013, and that's the number of new jobs needed to match population growth. Now, how many job openings do we have? A lot. Almost 32,000. Registered nurses, software developers, all kinds of different, across the skill spectrum here. We have, as I said, 0.68 available workers per job opening, about the same as it was pre-COVID now. And then the increase in the labor force for our area, that's another huge thing. We didn't keep pace. We had more people moving here, but we did not have concomitant increases in the labor participation, but now we do. Look at how it's taking off in the upper right-hand corner. And if I look at the more recent, just from May of 2014, the increase in the labor force has been almost 16%, while the increase in the working age population is 9.5%. So that's another reason our region is doing well. Now, local wages, people talk a lot about this. I'd like to show this one. Mostly, we know that our wages are lower, but look at how far back that goes. Wages are sticky. It's very hard to kind of catch up, if you will. And then if we look at it for, comparing El Paso County to Colorado, we're 17% lower in 2020 and 13% lower than the US. The more recent data shows that chasm closing a little bit, but that's going to take some time. Now, we can all kind of speculate probably the reasons that, the wages are lower. We have a lot of retired military who work part-time or do consulting work, military spouses, a legacy of lower wages, which I mentioned before, large hospitality sector. But with everything that's happening right now with, wages being pushed up all of the sudden, even in the hospitality sector and so forth, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with this. I don't know that I know the answer. And then in terms of demographics, the US population has increased about 40% in the last 50 years. We've doubled in El Paso County. Obviously, huge implications for housing. And we will be over 1 million by 2050. We're younger, and I've often showed this slide, and this also has housing implications. The US, basically if you look at the young ages here, they're either increasing very slowly or flat, whereas in El Paso County, those young ages are increasing very nicely. 65 plus is also increasing, but we have the young people increasing at the same time, which is fantastic. And then just here you can see what is the composition of the different households, married with families, married with children, and so forth. Just for the sake of kind of knowing what our demographic composition is within households. And then in terms of federal poverty level, we do not have as high a percentage of people under the federal poverty level in El Paso County, as you can see here. Now, federal poverty level is really low. I mean, for an individual, it's 12,000. For a family of four, it's almost 26,000 in 2019. And this is census data, so it's a bit dated. And then here, I now have this on my dashboard. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically, here it just says, what is the living wage according to the MIT Living Wage Calculator? I've looked at a bunch of them. This is the one that I find to be sort of the most realistic and probably conservative. Households with one adult and two children, you basically need to make $40 an hour to have childcare and housing and so forth with what costs are now. We have about 32% of households in El Paso County with a median income below $50,000. So, this has big implications. Again, it's that bifurcation, right? People who can afford stuff are doing really quite well, but the people who are falling anywhere near or below a living wage really struggle, particularly with housing, which is their largest cost component. And I already talked about that. And then in terms of veteran status, we have a lot of veterans, we know that, in El Paso County, about almost 84,000 as of 2019. And then very educated. That's something that has been helping us for years and continues to help us and is also true locally. And that also, it's fantastic from finding skilled labor, but it also increases your asking price for homes because you have more people who can afford it, right? Because more educated people typically have higher incomes. And then here it is for some college or associate's degree. Colorado Springs actually outperforms Colorado in the US for ages 25 plus. And then what about housing? Well, here you can see, here are the main reasons that people moved during COVID, okay? They moved somewhere safer, they lost the job or income, they wanted to take care of family, started working from home, 28%. And this isn't census data, we can't get census data fast enough. This is hire a helper. This is what economists have had to be reduced to, right? We have to rely on these things, but it's 75,000 nationwide moves that were analyzed. And then here, just in that article that I mentioned on work from home that came out on Sunday, looking at, basically it's here to stay to some extent. Most studies are showing about 18 to 20% some work from home. But there is a disconnect. Definitely have employees wanting to work from home more than employers want them to. And then here, the states that were the biggest winners and losers from the migration, Idaho #1, which is really interesting. And then, here I'm going to go quickly because I think a lot of you know this data already by definition being here, but we had a 14% increase Q1 of 2020 to Q1 of 2021, and the median home price was almost $400,000. We're now 21% higher than the US, half a month's supply of housing in May, and days on market was 10 days. But if you look at just May, just a little bit after the end of Q1, look at where the median and average home price is there. We're almost at $500,000 for the average home price, $232,000 for the median home price. And those are the little stars I have there. That's called logarithmic increase, right? When it just kind of shoots up. And then here you can see that, on average, the rule of thumb is that a home price doubles in 20 years. But here it took us 10 years, okay? The forecast that, I very reluctantly am making is for increases for our region to be about 19% for average home price and close to that for median home price. And you can see that those levels are pretty close to where we are now, but often summer prices are where things kind of level off a bit. We'll see if that's accurate or not. And then in terms of price appreciation, this is how we compare to some other cities you can see from the Q1 data. Denver's median home price, look at Boulder's at 726, which is really incredible, sixth most expensive city. Colorado Springs is now up to 29th. And then this is kind of interesting. You know how earlier I showed you the preponderance of homes sold in the United States are between the 100 and 500,000? Well, in Colorado Springs, it's from 300 to 800. So the categories are a little bit different, but that goes to show you more expensive homes are definitely being sold in our area. Foreclosures are still nice and low, at least thus far. Home ownership in El Paso County in 2006 was 72%, and now it's at 66.5%. So we used to do a lot better than the US here, but now we're about the same. And then here, this Housing Opportunity Index that I mentioned earlier, we're at 63.6, which is pretty close to the US, but we're down from 71.4%. And remember, this is the percentage of people who can afford the median price home who make the median income. Boise, I don't know what happened to Boise. They used to be at 53.5 just a couple years ago, and now only 35%. So that kind of is a model of what not to do for affordable housing. And then home building, most of the builders I talk to are just, for obvious reasons, saying that they're really struggling. So how many more homes can they sell and build? El Paso County was #1. Out of the 10 Colorado counties for permit activity comparing 2020 to 2021, even above Douglas and Denver counties. The healthy number of permits was increased from 5,800 by my estimates to 7,000. We're meeting that now mostly because of multifamily, but single family still seems to probably be just chugging along not quite quickly enough. And then PPAR asked me to do an economic impact analysis of what is sort of the overall impact of housing. It's pretty incredible. In 2019, there were 12,000 direct jobs in our region attributable to real estate, but if you include the business-to-business activity and then sort of the spillover of those people consuming, we're talking about almost 24,000 jobs due to real estate. The associated labor income is $1.5 billion. Contributing $4.1 billion to regional activity and $67 million in local taxes alone. And then if you look at the bottom left, it's the same impact but for the state of Colorado. Pretty similar, right? Because most of the impact is within our region, except look at the tax revenue, $518 million if you include state, local, and all additional taxes. And then the backside of the infographic just shows some of the statistics that I've already talked to you about, just in terms of why things are so hot in this region for population growth and so forth. And then the rental market, we're now at about $1,300 per month for new and old units combined in terms of the apartment rent, almost $1,600 for newer apartments. And this is in sharp contrast to just a few years ago. And then here you can see what's happened to the average rent and the vacancy rate. And our vacancy rate is actually lower than the nation now and lower than the Denver region. The effective growth rate continues to be high, which is why we continue to see a lot of investment in multifamily in our area. And then here, this is the same type of data that I showed you earlier. The bottom line on this is that here I'll show you, whoops, sorry, went back. That, even at $12 an hour, most renters are compromised, just in terms of what they can afford. The fair market rate would be about $22 an hour for most renters to be able to afford sort of your average two-bedroom apartment. We're still considered a tight market according to Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And then here you can see the difference in rent between us and Denver is just not as big as it used to be even when I moved here a few years ago. It's really closing in. And then just a couple last slides. The commercial vacancy rates were going down nicely and then have increased. And nationally and locally, probably vacancy rates are going to continue to creep up during this year. but really not so much for the industrial as much as for the office market because of work from home. Moody's is projecting that the office vacancy rate will be about 19% this year nationwide. And then we already talked about that. Retail at about 10%, but that's because the vacancy rate was already pretty high and a lot of closures there. And then industrial, as I mentioned, nice and low. Now this is interesting, even with the cost of renting for commercial real estate here edging up, we're still a lot cheaper than Denver. That's the bottom line. So that's good news from the perspective of having businesses move here. And then tourism is rebounding nicely. This is the 12-month moving average. Our actual vacancy or occupancy rate was 70%. And our profitability for hotels is now almost back to pre-pandemic levels. And then look at employments. That's the blue line. We actually have an increase now in employments versus 2 years ago. So that's really good news. And don't forget to look before you book. And that's it. That's the entire presentation. There is a dashboard. I think most of you know that, that sponsors get. And then if you want to take a look at any of the publications, you can find them on the website for the forum.
Thank you, Tatiana. That was great information to set the scene for our next two speakers. But first of all, I'm going to introduce Chris Brown, who's the VP of Policy and Research for the Common Sense Institute, and he's going to introduce our two speakers. Thanks, Chris.
All right. You're moving the slides, or you need me to? Okay. Great. Well, thank you again. That was a great segue. I think there's some good information in there that we'll be able to touch on. Thank you to the Housing and Building Association and all the event sponsors for today's event. Housing and housing affordability has been an issue at the top of our minds for several years, and I think this is an important venue and forum to feature the work of the CSI Fellows and really engage in dialogue about the scope of the problem and solutions. So really look forward to listening in and having your thoughts and feedback as our fellows discuss their recent research. So let me give you a little bit of a video about CSI and who we are in our work before I introduce Peter and Evelyn.
A healthy, growing Colorado, built on a solid foundation. Data, bigger than bias, using time-tested analytical tools to give citizens the facts. We are CSI, the Common Sense Institute, and our mission is to examine the fiscal impacts of policies and initiatives so that the laws that impact our lives allow individual opportunity to flourish, not skewed or bent by politics or partisanship. Our team includes some of the best and brightest policy minds in Colorado, and our board of directors from every corner of our state encompass Colorado's vital industries. We are committed to the protection and promotion of Colorado's economy, because in our opinion, that's just common sense. We are the Common Sense Institute.
Okay, so we take on a lot of different research topics as an organization. Really, our mission is to study and release publications, release educational materials around, Colorado's, again, most significant, most pressing economic issues. And so that ranges from healthcare to transportation to energy. But as I said, housing has been really at the forefront for several reasons. Our board of directors at CSI really are the heart of our organization, have prioritized this issue in many different ways and represent a wide range of industries and regions across Colorado and have consistently said through our work, we need to be emphasizing this topic. One of our founding board members, Terry J. Stevenson, who left our board a couple years ago and then just recently rejoined, launched this fellowship to take on some of the most challenging issues at the intersection of public policy and growth. And last year, we conducted a study related to transportation. The two CSI fellows, Henry Sobenet and Ben Stein, led that work and published a paper that in many ways sort of led the foundation for some of the recent legislation that passed at the State House. Now, pros, cons, trade-offs, it's not all good, but there was a lot of the foundational work that they examined last year that ended up being included as part of that work. So really our hope through this is to discuss these big ideas, look at them from different perspectives, and an interesting dynamic to this fellowship that I think is really important to highlight and I think is an important context for the discussion, the ideas that you'll hear here, it's an attempt, or the purpose is to challenge two individuals with different backgrounds, different ideas, and even political affiliations, to come together, write a joint paper that focuses on these issues. So this year, the specific issue tasked with Evelyn and Peter was housing affordability. Go. That was it. And so it's about finding solutions. And we didn't know what we were going to get into when we started this discussion, frankly, at the end of 2020. But they've really stepped up to the challenge. And I can't thank them enough for your guys' hard work and dedication. And I think some of the ideas that they'll share today really should, I think, inspire and bring about change. So let's get into it. Evelyn Lim is the Director of Policy and Research at the American Cornerstone Institute. She was formerly the Department of Housing and Urban Development's Region 8 Administrator, which covers Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Peter Lafari is the Executive Director of Maker Housing Partners, the housing authority in Adams County, one of 3,000 housing authorities across the country. Maker works alongside other members of the community across the country to ensure housing needs are advocated for on a national level. So welcome and thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
If you want to do a quick stretch, my foot fell asleep over here, so I totally understand if you need to do that. I just want to thank everybody for having us here, and obviously Terry J. Stevenson, who brought Peter and I together. As Chris mentioned, our mandate was to look at housing affordability in Colorado. I was the HUD administrator here in Region 8, and I had met Peter through my work there. Thought he was great, and so was really pleased when we got to work together to talk about some of these big policy issues. I think one of the greatest things about this is that we really challenged ourselves to look at what are some actual tangible solutions that we can implement in the state. A lot of times policy papers really just look at ideas, and so this fellowship allowed us to think beyond that. Peter has a lot of development experience at the Housing Authority, and so that's been really great to actually get the on-the-ground experience. So before we get into it, I'll just let Peter do some opening remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. And I just want to thank everybody for your time. We know there are multiple conflicting priorities that could take you from here. And so for everybody in attendance, either virtually or in person, it really means a lot to us. I also want to thank the CSI team and board for giving us this unique opportunity to really kind of widen the lens and challenge narratives and really look at the housing development value chain as CEOs. And so I am amazed by the information that Tatiana shared. It was the perfect kind of tee up for us. The economics are not normal. They are hyperlogical right now, and we believe that we have every opportunity as Coloradans to kind of change that trajectory, and the tools are in front of us currently. And so we'll talk a lot about that. And I also want to just kind of say, look, we're going to challenge some notions, but we believe in people, and we have like a no shame, no blame policy. When we look at these things, it's not the people behind the outcomes, it's the tools, the policies, procedures, and methodologies. And so, you know, I'm a firm believer in organizational health and leadership methodologies like Simon Sinek shares. And so, you know, as leaders, we eat last, and I think as we look at those trade-offs, it becomes clearer how we can adjust a path forward of opportunity, life, and love for all Coloradans to be able to stay here, have a healthy and happy home, contribute to our society, and pursue their own individual version of the American dream. So, Evelyn, I'll give it back to you.
So a little bit about our methodology here, because we really tried to approach it from a different perspective. We were really inspired by an author, Amanda Ripley, who talks about high conflict and high conflict situations, which we think are part of our housing development continuum right now. So it's really this binary construct where we see us versus them. And what she says is that if you put up that dichotomy, everybody kind of goes to their own group of people. And so when you have two oppositional groups, you have toxic relationships, and your outcomes are diminished. So we took that into consideration, and we wanted to look at how do we get beyond that. We went to our stakeholders in the state, so we went across Colorado and talked to all the experts who are actually doing the work, whether it's commissioners, land use experts, attorneys, developers, contractors, you name it. We had a stakeholder interview list beyond 40. Peter and I would joke that we could actually keep going, but we had to stop it at some point. And you know, this is some of the stuff that they told us, that, you know, housing develop is being opposed, and folks are pushing back against the population gains we've experienced. And that housing affordability advocates, we can't create greater affordability without the missing middle housing. So we really took that into consideration when we talk about housing here. We're talking about all housing. And so that means affordable, missing middle, market, everything.
Yeah, you know, by widening the lens and kind of moving away from what is like the traditional entry points to these conversations, we were able to have transcendent conversations with experts that really put down their guards. And what we found was that, you know, the narratives are actually diminishing our ability to come together to serve the better good of our population. And it's putting everyone in these very uncomfortable prisoners' dilemmas, right? So, you know, if we look at it and we say, well, where in the value chain are we either adding value or distracting from it or diminishing from it? We took a real Six Sigma kind of process improvement approach to this. And through that, folks, I think, let their guard down and started talking about what type of trade-offs they'd be willing to make to drive transformational change. And when we talk about transformational change, we're talking about how do we get from what I like to say dream to grand opening, right? The gestation process is like wine in this business, right? It takes a long time to get from financing to rezone, to review, to certificate of occupancy. And so in the best of times, especially for affordable housing, it's 3 years. On average, it's more like 5. That's a lot of volatility. That's a lot of risk mitigation, risk sharing. And what we find is the end user is always the burden holder of those types of processes. So how can we speed it up? And how can we start and ask each and every element of the continuum to look inward through that kind of Six Sigma approach? And these are the questions we ask to get there. So what are the force multipliers? Like, how can we get from where we are today to where we need to go to meet the needs of our growing population, to be able to provide product across the continuum, for sale market, missing middle, for sale, and you'll see a study that we will share out of Telluride that we're really excited about because it completely disrupts the value chain and is able to provide for sale affordable housing for folks with the incomes like we saw from Tatiana without using low-income housing tax credits because we can't solely rely on LIHTC to bring us where we need to be because we want more home ownership. We want folks to be able to benefit from the wealth generation that a home provides to help get at this income gap, this income inequality dynamic. Where are the rabbit holes? We like to talk about the shiny object. It's natural, but what might be leading us astray and influencing our decision analysis, the public discourse that gets us off track? And so we'll share more on that. Evelyn, if you want to, where are we doing it right? You know, so again, this led us to look towards solutions across the state. This is a statewide report that we did over 4 months. We would love to be able to see the Institute or other coalitions of committed and engaged individuals to be able to take some of these ideas, overlay them in a specific location, municipality, locality, and start to do some real cost-benefit analysis. And that's the next step. What's no one saying? And then if you had your magic wand, as I like to say, if it's Christmas morning, what are you waking up to? How would you fix the issue?
And these questions really come back to Amanda Ripley and how you open up the conversations by asking these open-ended questions. So we didn't want to lead anybody anywhere. And Peter and I were very cognizant of the fact that, you know, even though we work in this field, we don't know all the answers. If we did, then what was the use of interviewing all these people? So open-ended questions, we just allowed the conversations to go. And you know, one of the things that I'll say, and thank you to the people in the room who we did interview, I think that we were really inspired by all of the ideas and talent in Colorado. I think one thing that we'll say at the top is we can fix this if we all kind of band together. So, you know, Dr. Bailey talked a little bit about housing, which was great, so we can kind of dig into our report. But I'll just give you a little bit of a background of how did we get here in the first place. And she mentioned this Wall Street Journal article that talked about the housing crisis that's a national crisis. And people always ask, you know, is Colorado any different? Where do we fit into that spectrum? And I'll tell you, it's pretty bad. We hate to be the harbingers of despair here, but Freddie Mac just recently said that Colorado is the 4th worst for housing shortages in the nation, behind only DC, Oregon, and California. So that's pretty bad, guys. We need to, we're underbuilding, and I think that that's important to say because we don't hear it enough. But this chart from Chris shows us that after the Great Recession, we just didn't build enough and we haven't been catching up.
And I'll jump in. This is not because we had a dereliction of duty. There was no liquidity, right? Folks, we all know that there was no credit to be received. Construction workers were being laid off. The entire industry essentially went into a pause mode. And because it takes so long, as we mentioned earlier, to be able to bring homes to market, we've really not been able to catch back up. And through that process, we've just exploded with heartbeats coming to this state to start their lives. It has exasperated our number one fear in life, which is change, right? And so rather than, kind of fall into these zero-sum constructs, as we mentioned before there, we're saying, let's stop talking about NIMBY and YIMBY, right? It just creates these zero-sum conflict binary constructs. And so it breaks down communication. And what we started to say is through this process, I couldn't just go to Evelyn and say, let's have this inclusionary zoning, playbook. You won't even see that really anywhere in the report. What we talked about was, we had to bring the math, we had to bring the policy evidence, and then we had to pitch each other, and then we had to find evidence from experts to back that up. So it really led us towards root cause analysis. And so, folks are naturally afraid of change, and I don't know any greater of a manifestation of change than development, right? So there's been plenty of studies that, folks don't necessarily react the same way they talk publicly when a new development goes up in their backyard, right? So rather than shame and blame, why don't we find the proverbial kitchen table so we can break bread together and talk about what are those drivers and get back to some sort of kind of logic-based discussion, which we do in all other aspects of our lives, in all other sectors of the economy, and move from the fear drivers to more logic-based outcomes while acknowledging and celebrating the human experience and all that goes into it, which generates the behaviors that many of us in the room have experienced consistently when we look at development and approval, right? So logic is not the topic of the day. But the reasons that we lead to these conversations are the very essence of what it means to be alive, right? We have to provide safety to those we love. We want to ensure that our nest eggs are protected. We want safe, healthy, vibrant communities. And so is there any question that we would have high conflict dynamics when we talk about adding more to our communities? And so through this process, we believe that it would free us to be able to look at this dynamic and make decisions that benefit all of our community members.
So I'm just going to jump back to a chart here. But this is for the state. Based on our projections, we're going to need 54,190 new housing units annually over the next 5 years. So this is before the chart, but in 1972, the most we've built is over 65,000 units, and we just haven't come close since. In the early 2000s, we built more housing than we had net immigration, and then the Great Recession hit. And so in 2008, we just built under 19,000 housing units. So we continue that downward trend. In 2009, we only built 9,355 units. So while there's severe constraints on our construction production, we still have enormous population growth. And so from 2007 to 2014, we added over 322,000 people to our state, which is about 40,000 a year. And then during that time, we only created 160,000 units.
Sure. So here we have El Paso for your viewing pleasure. Very similar to what we heard from Tatiana. And I think this is probably known to many of us in the room today. And really, when we look at it, the challenge is we want to grow. We have an economic development strategy and methodology so that we can provide for the basic needs of our communities, infrastructure, water, sewer, basic needs. But with this explosion of population, it is exasperating all of those human elements that we discussed previously, because although we have tremendous capacity to develop the units that are required, a lot of the process is elongated and litigated to the point that we're not able to deliver the amount of units that we're capable of creating. And so again, we're in this kind of construct that is really challenging to us because and many of us have seen depopulation dynamics in cities across our great country that challenge localities to be able to keep the tax base where it needs to be to meet the needs and continue to expand upon our infrastructure. And so, this is really the challenge here, this nexus between the housing shortfall, our new residents, and housing units created is the driver of high conflict, right? So if we can attack this number and we can get at it through the construction value chain and try to drive greater efficiencies, which we'll talk about later, we'll be able to provide greater amounts of housing at a variability of housing price points without having to rely on demand-side solutions, which is traditionally what we've been doing over the last decade here.
Okay, so here's the beginning of our report here. So both Peter and I come from running organizations, both small to huge and everything in between. And we really decided that because there's so much, there's different entities along the whole development continuum, that we really needed to take an enterprise kind of CEO approach to how we address these issues. So I'll let Peter go through all of these, but I just wanted to outline that, a lot of these high conflict parts of when we're developing, we really wanted to put these principles down on paper to say, if there's an issue, if there's a decision to be made, let's go back to our guiding principles. These really should be guiding our leaders and our community members as we go through the whole housing continuum process.
Yeah, as a leader, I study great organizations, teams, methodologies, and many of us have core values in our organizations that guide our behaviors and decision making. We all have our own unique, beautiful personal histories that bring us together, and the greatest teams use these to be able to navigate very gray area decision making. And so, many of us have talked about the Broncos, right? And how the Broncos perhaps have lost their way because they've gotten away from, ground and pound and strong defense, right? So having an identity helps make decisions in a hyper complex, highly conflicted, fear-driven world. Many of us in this room are duty-bound to those that we serve. We need to listen to them and we need to respond. And so when we look at it, I always come back to a couple of examples that I think illuminate this. And so, Southwest, very early, Herb wrote on the back of a napkin, he goes, we're going to democratize the skies. We're going to be the lowest cost provider lowest cost air provider in the United States, and we're going to have one plane, right? And so early on, one of his senior leadership team members took a flight on a competitor, came back in, they had served fried chicken, and they were just so ecstatic over it. It was amazing. Everybody on the flight loved it. So they brought it to Herb, and they said, hey, Herb, what do you think? Let's make fried chicken. Herb, pointed and said, will this help us be the lowest cost provider in the United States? And the individual said no, and he said, that's your answer. That's your answer. We have nothing like this right now for housing, even though it's the most emotionally driven, highly complex, challenging dynamic for everyone in the continuum, especially our local officials. And so instead of blaming folks, we should acknowledge that this is the last industry, frankly, in the world economy that has been modernized, and all the decision-making processes exasperate that natural fear that is around what happens when we have change. And so, we want to do away with that, and we want to get back to, this idea that, as Coloradans with the pioneering spirit, as Americans, when we come together, there's nothing we can't accomplish, right? And we demonstrated this the last time we had a major housing crisis in this country, when the great men and women came home from the European and Pacific theaters and needed to be housed after World War II, right? We had all the same similar systemic challenges, right? Concerns, local control dynamics, fear of change, financing challenges. We made it happen. Old Man Levitt, who wasn't as old back at that time, but I like to call him Old Man Levitt, went to Congress and said, I'll house our troops, but here's what you need to help me do. You need to give me better economies of scale. We need more standardization. We need to be able to do what private industry does to be able to rapidly ramp up the production of high quality at types of unit creation at price points that Americans can afford, right? And so if we do away with those binary constructs, then we can come together with a unified purpose, which will then dictate the policies, procedures, and behaviors that bring those to life. We're just going to say this right now, if you don't embrace growth, you disagree with us. And that's okay. That's okay. We fully expect that folks are going to say, you know what, I don't believe you. And that's your right. And that's one of the elements that we think makes us as special as we are as a country. And so if we embrace the idea of growth, we will then start to do what we did for the greatest generation, which is pay for off-site improvements. We paid for all the infrastructure as we housed America, and we're asking ourselves to consider doing that again. Most importantly, for deeply affordable housing, but even for middle housing, even for single-family homes. Freddie all the stock issues we have is we have no single family stock. We have condo defects. We'll talk a little bit about that, right? Folks are still waiting out the statute of limitations from the 2017 legislative fix, which has great promise, but the risk management is too great. As we talk to our experts, many of them from Colorado Springs, developers, they want to build more of their portfolio as attainable, attached product, but the risk of litigation on both their business and their personal lives is just too great. And so they're sitting on the sidelines, and that means the entire continuum is stressed. Our great-grandparents, we love them, they need to downsize. They downsize into what is also single-family starter homes or attached starter homes. So they're competing, as Tatiana shared, right? They're competing with all the millennials that are acting just like every generation before them. Once they fall in love, have children, have a little bit of capital, they want to buy a home. And what's happening concurrently is that's exasperating all these fissures within our continuum. So if we say be proportional, equitable, and inclusive, what we're really saying there is let's have a master planning process, let's get the public community input, let's make decisions, let's make sure that we're reaching out to disadvantaged populations who have traditionally not been afforded the opportunity to drive wealth and power at these tables, and then let's not move the goalposts after halftime, right? That's happening all the time, right? We have massive redundancies in our housing development approval processes. Again, because we feel duty-bound to address the needs of our constituents who have every right to feel concerned about increased traffic, increased safety, but we have a logical progression that if we default to, and if we work towards being, not sending mixed message to our Coloradans, then we should see a movement up in the trust quotient. Easier said than done, though, right? As I mentioned before, just build, baby, build is not going to help our Coloradans that are living with a disability on SSI. It's not going to help our seniors that are living on a single fixed income. It's not going to help folks that are working to increase their income as they move through their young adult and adult lives. And so, if we can address that through this process and not rely on inclusionary zoning alone to drive these outcomes, the entire continuum will benefit. One of our greatest things that we're really excited about is embracing these new building methodologies. We believe that Colorado can be the hub of the modernization of the construction industry in our country and frankly in North America, and we'll talk more about that. And then if we act with a sense of urgency and purpose, as we've done at major challenges throughout our nation's history, watch out. Nobody can catch us, and we can do tremendous things.
So one of the things, and Peter covered this a little bit in the beginning, but the way we structured our report was, we went to the experts. So we really curated some of those ideas from them, and you'll see that in the report about what they thought was going to work in the community. And then we took those, and we'll delve into a little bit of those later, but we asked, what are really the force multipliers? What if we implemented them now? They will assist throughout the entire housing continuum. So again, not just affordable, although we do believe that that is an important segment, but also for our market rate housing. And then, we came up with a blueprint in terms of what can really transform our housing industry here in Colorado. And so we're really excited about that. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Oh, and I will say, Peter mentioned construction defects, and so we didn't really delve into it in our report, although it came up a lot in our industry interviews. And the reason is not because we thought it's solved. As he mentioned, we still think that there is a big issue, that a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines because the risk is too big. Still, after the 2017 fix at the legislature, the statute of limitations is still out there, and so people are not building the townhomes and condos that we need to really fit that market. And so that is an issue. It's something that we said, needs continuing, we need to take a look at. And I think oftentimes we find that when the legislature acts, they kind of think that, okay, it's done now. We're asking them to continue to take a look at it because we don't think it's fixed.
Yeah, there's a collaborative called the Colorado Housing Affordability Project, which is a network of experts in land use planning, economics, financing, equity, debt, developers of all types. And what we liked about their idea was that we felt it was very common sense, and it was an olive branch to all of the individuals in the continuum. And so we talk about some of their ideas, which is really to unlock additional land to be utilized for affordable housing development. And again, agreed upon through that kind of proportional, equitable, and inclusional approach so that we can expedite the process and mitigate the amount of delays and redundancy within review and approval processes. And so right now, we really believe from what we've heard from our experts is that the housing that's being built is the housing we allow. I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward, but it's true. Each of the risk points are transferred to the end user. And right now, the risks of developing homes at an affordable amount, when you look at the hard costs, right, which we'll discuss later, it drives these types of outcomes. And so if we can have greater use by right overlays using some of these methodologies that will allow greater quads, duplexes, missing middle solutions, we can start to expedite through that hard cost process, which includes the review planning. And so we like the idea of 25 dwelling units per acre on properties within 1/8 of a mile of a fixed transit station. You know, frankly, folks on my side, on the affordable housing dynamic, we like, that's not enough, Peter. Right? It needs to be more. Why don't we have more density? Well, we're already asking a lot of our fellow Coloradans here. And so if we're willing to make trade-offs, we feel like this is a reasonable point. But we also believe in the strength and power and knowledge of everyone who's elected and engaged in your community. If you feel that number can go up and there's buy-in, well, by all means you can go further. But we thought that this was a compromise, and compromise was driving our ethos from the start. And so if we allow by right a minimum of 10 dwelling units per acre and at least 10% of the land area in town, we're now starting to open up the opportunities for this continuum that we don't have currently. And so we're asking folks to take a look at that and consider if that would make sense for your locality, for El Paso County. And if it's not enough, you can move it further. If it's too much, you can consider why those trade-offs. But if we come back to what we talked about talking with a purpose, we're asking ourselves to say, every decision we make, is it going to drive the creation of more housing and thus greater supply and allow the market to adjust as it always has? Right now, we're constraining the market is what we found. If we allow that to happen, then folks will be able to have greater supply opportunities, which will drive greater competition, and that leads into our challenge grant and our transformational change.
So we also asked our interviewees, you know, what are the exciting and big ideas out there that are really rabbit holes or are kind of taking away from the conversation because we're not sure if they really work. And I'm sure you all have heard about the elimination of single-family zoning. It's kind of one of those hot topics. And time again, this kind of came up as one of the policy issues that was all hat, no cattle. I think the issue is it's too soon to tell. We saw that Minneapolis did this just recently. It has not been the boon that many had hoped. So what they did in Minneapolis was they allowed on a single family lot throughout the city, they allowed duplexes and triplexes. What we've seen though is that, so this was maybe 2 years ago that they implemented it. So far last year, they really only got 3 permits throughout the city to change from a single family to a duplex. And those were actually just revisions. Those weren't new, they weren't building new things. So what we're really seeing from that example is that you have to address some of the other zoning issues in order for this to really take off. We don't know yet if that's gonna work, but we do know that it's something that a lot of communities are considering. You can see in the report we talk a lot about ADUs and how California has allowed ADUs by right on any single-family zoned lot. So these are all things that are out there that have some promise, perhaps, but it's really up to the community to look at how they want their communities to look, whether they're going to allow ADUs or eliminate single-family zoning. I'll say that, you know, if we look to other communities that are doing this, we don't really have good examples. Oregon did it statewide, but they delayed implementation, so that's not being implemented. And then Portland followed last year and allowed duplexes and triplexes on single-family zoned lots. So we just don't know. It's too soon.
Evelyn did some great research, and we cite kind of a pilot project up in Denver, which helps kind of eliminate some of these barriers, because it's really difficult for professionals to develop housing. Imagine us asking, you know, our homeowners to do that same dance. And so an idea could be, if there's a desire for a standard ADU code, excuse me, how about a suite of pre-approved design standards, right? And maybe a couple of builders who opt in that become certified as trusted vendors, and maybe financiers, debt and equity players to help, right? If we eliminate some of the complexity and provide greater confidence to our homeowners, they've been proven, this is also happening in Charlotte, and they're actually taking it a little step further and offering a financial incentive. But the trade-offs of that are going to be those off-site improvements. So if we're going to require the homeowner to put in a new parking spot or improve the sidewalk, it's going to kill the creation of those ADUs. And so, again, what are we incentivizing, and why are we incentivizing, and how we're talking to our fellow Coloradans and being clear and not sending mixed messages is really driving results across the country, and we think we could do it here as well.
So under the header of what's not working, we have anti-growth measures that we know are happening in a lot of communities. It's happened in a couple communities here in Colorado. And, you know, Peter and I really view this as the biggest threat to housing affordability in the state. We took a long look at it because, you know, coming from different ends of the political spectrum, we had this huge debate about local control. And I think, you know, what we're saying here is not anti-local control. The, you know, the idea that the community judges for itself how it wants its community look, what it builds, is definitely still at play here. But what we've seen is that these anti-growth measures really constrain the surrounding communities. It's really a regional issue. And so, you know, there has been precedent in our state where we've seen that the legislature has said that housing is a statewide concern. And so, you know, we think that these anti-growth measures should be taken up by the state legislature. There's nothing else that's going to drive costs up more if we continue down an anti-growth path.
Yeah, this one hurt, and we came to it with a heavy heart and a somber mind. We believe that local control is a highly effective form of governance. It works in so many myriad of positive ways, but with the you know, the regionality and the devastating economic impacts, which we will see in the report if we're lucky enough for y'all to read some of it, is that it provides just such a significant threat to our state economy. And it asks other localities to disproportionately pick up this burden, which is a statewide burden. And so we've said to, you know, and we talk to developers, it's the thing that everyone says. But there's just a fear because of, you know, the fact that we have such a strong local control, and it has served us very well. But there are two instances in the state history where the legislature has identified and ratified housing laws. One is about a PUD Act, the other is around mobile homes. And we believe, and there'll be the three localities that have anti-growth ordinances would not be required to rescind them. That would not be part of this. But ultimately what it would say is it would just protect our great state from what we consider essentially scuttling our own ship. to use a Navy metaphor. And so we know that it's asking a lot. We know that it's challenging. But we also know that everything we do could be completely undermined if we allow anti-growth ordinances like the Initiative 66, which the proponent did not have enough signatures, but is still percolating out there like a tornado on our front range, blowing through and damaging all of our efforts. So I know this one's a little controversial, so we're just going to leave there. So we got thick skin. I know I see a head nodding, saying no. Where I could say here is that when we look at the construction value chain, the development value chain, it is highly disaggregated. It is absolutely project specific. This has led to the construction industry. So McKinsey & Associates in June of 2020, we cited in the report, interviewed over 400 construction CEOs across the world, many of them from North America. And what they found was what many of us know who develop is that you can close your eyes on a job site in 2021 and open them and really be in 1990 or 1975. The man-hour productivity gains year over year is the lowest out of any other sector of our economy. Less than 1% man-hour productivity gains year over year, compared to 2.8% for all other sectors of the global economy combined, right? Why is that? It's because we allow no standardization. No standardization. Every other industry has gone through modernization. Car building has been automated to a great extent. Shipbuilding is another example that has gone from extremely hand and labor intense to more standardized so that we can drive greater economies of scale. Statewide building codes are not unique. There's many of them. Many states have statewide building codes. We are really coming at this as a way that we can dip our toe into the water and really drive forward towards greater economies of scale, less barriers of entry for our contractors and our subs, greater standardization. This does not touch at all on design standards, right? So if localities want to continue to have great variance within design standards from locality to locality, that is completely up to you. But what this does, though, is it starts to demonstrate how we can gain those greater efficiencies through standardization in the building code. And what we heard from these 400 CEOs was that they felt that the industry was going to modernize within the next 5 to 10 years. The first reason was a severe shortage of highly skilled labor, and we talk a lot about that in the report, which are driving cost overruns. Second was because of this disaggregated, highly project-specific, non-standardized environment, we have a worldwide affordable housing crisis, and we've seen that very acutely here. Because we're not allowing the free market to be able to operate at the level that it's capable of. And so the third there was if we want more green and sustainable technologies, then we're going to have to drive greater efficiencies within the home building process. They go through a bunch. The last was that in Europe, they're moving towards more standardized business codes, design standards, and review processes, which will allow for the industry to modernize. So right now in Europe, they are throwing tons of money into R&D to essentially take the home building process and automobilize it, right? Automobilize it. So imagine in this scenario, and I used an iPhone reference the last time, and it confused people, so I'm going to use a car reference this time instead. And I know we had people that were there. But imagine if we were building cars, and we had to have 50 different versions of our Ford F-150. That's the most popular vehicle in the country, right? So we had 50 different versions of the Ford 150. Then we had another different version for every single locality within our state of Colorado. If we even brought that vehicle to market, it would be like having to have a mortgage for a house, right? So if we start to think about the value chain of creating housing and delivering housing, we start to see waste and redundancies and cost drivers that we can attack. We can attack it now. It's been done in every other sector, right? So is this driving value or is it exasperating it, right? So if we look at it, it's very clear that by not having a statewide building code, we are adding additional time, money, opportunity costs. If you're an architect and you go from one locality that's on an IBC, and you're lucky enough to go to another locality that's on an earlier version of the IBC, it's a little easier, right? But you're still burning time. And that time goes to the developer. That time goes to us. It goes to the end user. It goes to the Coloradan who's trying to buy a home for $350K here, right? Each step of the way, that cost gets passed on to the end user, which is us, which is our Coloradans. And so if we can get to that point, then we can start to drive these efficiencies. And this is really leading into our inspiration around how can we make Colorado the offsite building hub mecca of this country. And the good news is we already have a head start. We have 2, if not 3, of some of the most sophisticated offsite builders. And as Evelyn likes to say, you can't tell the difference. In market rate luxury communities, offsite building methodologies are permeating throughout their strategy. You can't. You look at one, you look at the other, they don't look different. And what happens there is, oh, by the way, they have 30% less waste, right? Because they're precision cutting. They're using BIM technology. Imagine if El Paso County started to allow BIM technology, that's essentially 3D printing, right, as part of your review process. So you could get a scale model to see where the issues are and expedite through there. These are American, kind of solutions with using American ingenuity that if we could unleash, we could really start to make a dent in our challenge.
And I'll just add, this was one of our big initiatives at HUD under Dr. Carson, was housing innovation. Same thing, that Peter was saying. We haven't really revolutionized the housing industry. It's one of the last industries to do so. And by allowing these innovative technologies, we could really drive the cost down of housing. And that's, this is kind of how I got there. Everybody's like, well, we don't really want to standardize the building code. Why would we do that? It's just, depending on who's making this code, it can get really expensive. And so, we looked at other states that did this. That really put some guardrails around changes to the building code. And, full disclosure, we looked at Florida, and we just recently saw a devastating condo building fall there just a few days ago. That was built prior to their building code. The impetus for them was really Hurricane Andrew in 1996 that really decimated the insurance industry in Florida. So they did a study. They brought all of the experts in the community who were doing this. They did extensive vetting, included the industry in these conversations, and then came up with and did a cost-benefit analysis of what the Universal Building Code would do for the housing industry in Florida. And then they put, additional guardrails. They said, well, the local community can go above and beyond what the state does, but it needs to go through the state. And you need to also look at how this was going to unlock, again, innovation. And that's the main driver. So, we said earlier in the presentation that it takes 3 years to get from, financing to grand opening. We need to cut that down. And then we will eliminate a lot of the cost in that whole process, which brings, obviously, the cost of housing down. So, everybody, again, Peter and I, we had these discussions. We had to convince each other a lot of times on the value of this. But I think when you look at the innovation and what we can unlock from a state building code, I think it's well worth it. And as long as everybody is participating in the process, we think we can get there. So, that's the important part.
Yeah, and we talked a lot about ensuring that special interests can't layer on incremental requirements that drive, non-aligned outcomes. So, I know that, up in my neck of the woods, right, like it's about sprinkler suppression systems, which drive insurance rates through the roof because you're sitting there with, thousands of gallons of water in your basement. Who's going to ensure that? You know, we want to protect against those. And ultimately, this would need to be driven by industry experts, just like we saw in Florida. They went through a 14-month process that has rock solid cost benefit analysis driving the trade-offs and decision making. And it would be informed by the folks that do the work, understand the opportunities, and can protect against, you know, any sort of craziness driving towards the outcomes that we don't desire. Yeah, you know, the other element here is you know, we looked at the critical path, right? And again, barring, you know, anti-growth initiatives, you can do everything right. You can get your financing in order, you can go through the community input process, you can get your approvals, and then all of a sudden you have no labor, right? So as we talked about with McKinsey & Associates, the number one concern from the 90% of the 400 CEOs in construction were like, they can't find labor, right? And we talk a lot about how, you know, labor, highly skilled labor, essentially allowed the United States to liberate the world, right? We would not have won World War II if we weren't able to mobilize the greatest manufacturing industry the world has ever seen, right? And so if we're going to do this concurrently, moving towards off-site building solutions does not mean we eliminate opportunities for Coloradans to earn a living with a quality of craftsmanship job. And it's quite the opposite. What we talk a lot about in our report is, frankly, what you guys are doing here. We cite the Housing and Building Association of the Springs has 12 schools that you've invested in working with since 2015, and you guys have 2,535 pre-apprenticeship certificates. We talk about the Associate General Contractors. We spent tons of time with the Home Building Association, and we love the careers in construction of Colorado. We think that, you know, we need to return to the you know, to the dignity, warmth, and grace of having a highly skilled trade. We also love the fact that the construction industry is a leader in inclusive and equitable solutions for all, right? So they're hiring more women and giving them opportunity to be able to have a career that pays a living wage. The prevailing wage from the Home Builders Association is in the low $30 an hour, right? We saw what's a living wage from Tatiana. That's above a living wage. We also know that we don't want our kids saddled with significant debt. Well, if you start in this construction career, Colorado, just like your program here, you start in 10th grade, you get your 220-hour certificate, then you move on to one of the 10 or 11 specialties. Maybe it's pipe fitting, you know, there's electrical, there's tons of opportunities. You come out and you have a job waiting for you. No debt. No debt whatsoever. You're returning home from incarceration. This is a recidivism fighting dynamo. And so we spend a lot of time in the report talking about how we have to start acknowledging and valuing and, frankly, lionizing highly skilled trades. The idea that it's college or bust, and both Evelyn and I have greatly benefited from college, graduate degrees, you know, you name it. But the reality is that there are multiple pathways for young people and, frankly, people transitioning. There's a boot camp that we talk about where folks can take a 4-week class 3 nights a week and be able to get their certificate. These opportunities are bountiful. They provide tremendous satisfaction. When you drive by a community that you've helped create, you get the tingles, right? You know, you bring your children there, you bring your parents, you get to show off what you built and how that's going to provide a home that will lead to happiness and, frankly, the pursuit of happiness that is baked into our Constitution. And so we're really bullish on bringing in more skilled labor. The HBA, oh, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think we need about 7,500 more highly skilled labor, men and women, to meet the demand over the next 7 years, right? And that's a lot, but we can do that. And we're starting to see many of our high schools throughout the Front Range embrace the program. I think they're at 23 now through the Home Builders program. They need to get to 65. In our report, we asked the leaders across the state, CEOs from all sectors, to invest in the program, scale the program so that we can meet the needs and give folks an opportunity to build Colorado.
Okay, I'm going to let Peter talk about this because he's very excited about this, but I'm also going to ask him that we kind of rush through so we can get to Q&A.
I thought we had a lot of time. So the Telluride Foundation to me is again widening the lens, disrupting the narrative, right? You know, LIHTC isn't the only solution. In fact, LIHTC is not a solution for affordable home ownership. But our friends up in Telluride, Paul Major, says it really well. We are attacking the cost of developing housing without the benefit of subsidies. We do this by taking out the cost of land. The cost of capital is key. We simply can't do it in any other way. So what they do is they partnered with school districts. So you have Norwood, Nuclear, and Ridgeway, and they're looking at this as one project. They're going to move. They're building 55 for-sale community land trusts, income and deed restricted, and you have to also be a local. And these homes are being built by an off-site builder here in Denver, right, using BIM technology, modeling technology, which reduces the amount of waste, delivers to the market. They have a production scale market home builder, GC, McSwain. They are taking a little bit of haircut on their margin because of their size, because of their productivity level. Also, they really believe deeply in housing our teachers. So there's a teacher shortage throughout the state. There's an acute shortage in the high country. And so these school districts say, you know what, we've got this land, it's sitting vacant, it's not generating tax revenue, we're not housing our teachers. Here's a mutually beneficial solution. So let's partner, let's donate the land through a 99-year land lease with very clear expectations and requirements using the deed and using an affordable housing covenant. And they say, okay, let's build on here. So now you've got a GC that's mission aligned, driving down cost per unit. You have off-site builders helping on their end. And then you have the school districts helping out with the cost basis of the land. Now, when those are developed, you're going to have more kiddos go into those schools, which helps with their funding. You're going to have increased tax revenue. So that vacant land that was just sitting on their balance sheet has now been brought to life and is helping everyone accomplish what they need to do. So what we found here is that I read it and I called Paul. I said, it sounds to me like you have a use by right kind of overlay for building and design standards, because what they've done was they've given Simple Homes like kind of like a smorgasbord, a menu of home types that they're going to be building, so they can drive, again, productivity, economies of scale. And Paul said, actually, no, we're not there yet. And that'd be part of a light bulb moment for us, because if that could happen, now we could start to have greater economies of scale across our state. And I'll jump forward because Evelyn's keeping me on track here. And this is what we came.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'll just say to set him up, because that is really the culmination of our work together. This was all kind of bringing us to this, what we call our blueprint. And in addition to that, because this was also something that we discussed, and I'll jump in when Peter talks about it, but one of the big things that's happening now is obviously the American Rescue Plan and this huge influx of federal dollars into our communities. And so, being a fiscal conservative myself, I wasn't that excited about it, but it's passed, it's appropriated. What are we going to do with it? Let's make sure we put it to good use. And there is no other place that I think it can be utilized than in housing. And we really need to, we talked a lot about the deficit that we're in, how we need to incentivize and change a lot of the process. How do we do that? We also need funding. So, the ARA is really a generational opportunity to do this. And so, I feel like even though we have a lot of, it was all of these, issues coming together that put us in this deficit, we're really at the right time where we can take some of this federal money and utilize it in our community so that we can really jumpstart this process.
Yeah, what a great opportunity to not incrementally ask our Coloradans to take on more of a tax burden, right? Or to incrementally strain our already stretched local budgets. And so this money gives us a chance to essentially do this demonstration project. And if we can really get innovative and think about this as we've talked about through the value chain, we think we can set a pretty significant precedent that would then be used as evidence to our Coloradans to drive the trust quotient higher, right? So what we're calling this is a Colorado Affordable Housing Crisis Challenge Grant, which will be championed by the governor. and hopefully our CEOs of our business and our leaders across our economy. And that will, could use some of the money that was just recently appropriated through House Bill 21-1271, which is an innovative affordable housing strategies. It will use some of the $500 million that we received through the state and local coronavirus recovery fund. But ultimately what it will do is it will try to incentivize a regional governmental partnership, where this is a coalition of willing and committed counties and municipalities who will endeavor to create a use by right affordable housing regional development overlay. And what that would consist of would be coming together to create a standardized building code, a suite of design standards, right, that are permissible for climate concerns, design when it comes to aesthetics, but to keep a certain amount of constraint on that and have it be on trend, right, on point. Coloradans aren't going to buy something that looks like a Soviet era block. Right, we're talking about Colorado, mountain chic, Colorado urban chic, Colorado suburban chic. It's going to be at or above what we currently have, right? So it's not like we're eliminating standards. We're just binding together so that we have multiple regional government. We have multiple governments having the same standard that will then have them be able to, which will be made possible by declaring an emergency. So normally this would take at least 1.5 to 2 years, right? You'd have to go through your master planning process, and it would take a long time. But we've reached out to legal experts, and a local government emergency declaration would allow for the temporary waiving of existing codes to come together to create this regional development overlay for this specific response predicated and driven by our COVID-19 pandemic.
And so we've seen this local emergency declaration happening just recently. And this is just one of the things that, Peter and I have talked about. I come from also a national security background. Peter has a national security background. We talked a lot about, does this warrant an emergency declaration? And really, what do you get out of it if you declare that, right? So at first, I was very hesitant. I didn't think it really got us much. It doesn't get us federal funding. It's not covered in the Stafford Act. And so, is this really just some sort of virtue signal saying that, housing is important. But really what this can do is, again, to jumpstart the process. If we can get beyond some of the red tape that surrounds housing, we can actually get moving faster. And so I think that's an important thing. And also when we talk about standardized building codes, again, I just want to say that this is all for the local community to develop on their own. So, we talk a lot about competing priorities. As a policymaker, I like to say the only preference is revealed preference. So, as leaders in your community, you want to be sure that you are prioritizing what you want to prioritize. So if climate is your priority, then you have to understand that by putting climate goals in your building code, that's going to increase prices, and you should look at that, and you make the determination for yourself on whether that's something you want to do as a community. You have to look at it all together, because when you start adding things to this building code, things are going to get expensive. And so those are the trade-offs that leaders have to make, and they have to understand that what is the value to their community. So we're not trying to prescribe what that building code is, but we just want to make sure that people are understanding that having a universal code is really going to help the process. It's going to make it faster. It's going to drive prices down if you make the right choices.
Yeah. So where's the carrot in here? Well, we also have precedent in our state with our Colorado Housing Finance Authority creating set-asides, either for disaster recovery uses, right? So there's a kind of a fast pass to tax credits for projects that are addressing a specific issue. We also had a 5-year LIHTC set-aside from 2010 to 2015 to support a Hope 6 grant award to Denver Housing Authority. We think now's the time to do the same thing. If these regional governments are willing to take this step and that leap of faith and drive forward in this manner, they should be rewarded with a specific set aside of low-income housing tax credits and private activity bonds, depending on the type of project, so that they can harness the will and drive forward to outcomes. It's been done before, it can be done again. Also, we have a great opportunity here to pilot a kind of a reciprocity-driven approach towards underwriting. Right now, through DOLA and the Division of Housing and CHAFA, both offer vehicles to help round out the capital stack. For debt providing, they are also involved in the Telluride project, as you'll see if you have time to read the report, right? So we want to introduce new forms of PRI capital so that we can do what Telluride did and sell homes, not just build multifamily. And we want to drive down redundancies and hopefully create what would long outlast this challenge grant period and create a joint underwriting task force, because right now the methodologies are different. They're different, and that creates confusion, and confusion creates additional time and inaction, and we want to eliminate that. And then here we would also say, look, if there's school districts, if there's state or local land, if there are community members that have excess land that they would like to donate, perhaps for a tax benefit, we're asking everybody to roll up their sleeves and get together and do this so that we can serve all of our Coloradans here in El Paso. And we've seen this. This has happened. Full disclosure, I had one of my project that's almost complete now was the donation from our county to our housing authority of a decommissioned children and an old asset, a decommissioned children and family services building that we have adaptively reused. And by taking out that cost basis, we created a theme, because that's where kiddos were placed into foster care because they needed to be. But we've taken that place of pain and put it into a place of respite. And so now we're going to have 12 youth aging out of foster care units, 116, many new construction. It would not have been possible without that donation. And so what the county did was they said, hey, Maker, hey, Peter, we're going to have a deed and we're going to have an affordable housing covenant with milestones that I needed to make, or else I would have had to have given the land back. And so there are a lot of safeguards and transparency to ensure that our Colorado public are aware of the investments were made and don't feel like as if there's any sort of shenanigans happening. And so this has happened. I think we could scale it, and if we want to use it for multifamily affordable housing, we can do so. If we want to use it for sale, deed restricted, locality restricted housing, we can do so. Okay, finally, we're asking OEDIT to harness the power of their Accelerator Industries grants, Advanced Industries Accelerator Grant, which focuses on bringing new technologies within manufacturing as one to our state via tax credits, development incentives for incentivizing employees. How great would it be if concurrently we were working to harness the power of our offsite industries, the investments into our highly skilled labor, to create essentially like what California has done with electric vehicles, right? So why can't we become the preeminent creator of the new value chain of construction in our country and in North America? The Europeans are trying to, kick us, they're going hard. They're going hard. Right now, as we mentioned, they're putting a ton of money into this process. And our challenge was to say, why them? If not us, who? If not now, when? Let's do this.
I'll just add, because I don't necessarily agree with the example, right, of California and electric vehicles. I think, again, it goes. Peter's laughing because we've had these discussions before, but it goes again back to what are your policy goals? I think in particular, California is pushing a particular policy goal here. This blueprint is really a blueprint for how do we get more housing, which I would say in the crisis that we're in, that is our goal. So so just a little bit of a change there, but that's the end of our report. We really enjoyed doing this together. I think we have some time for some questions, and I hope everybody will read it. We wrote it so that it wouldn't be super wonky for just housing people to look at and legislators, and we hope that it really addresses issues from across Colorado, that any Coloradan can read it. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn and Peter. That was great. And thank you to Tatiana. Can you please, you might have to share microphones because we're going to try and get questions, but Tatiana, if you could come up and to the front. So does anybody have any questions for Evelyn, Peter, or Tatiana? Sure you do. Dirk.
So in the audience today, we have folks from industry, we have county commissioners, we have city councilors as well. So really a broad sweep of the industry, or a broad sweep of the participants in addressing these issues. Does the blueprint, haven't had a chance to read it yet, does the blueprint identify who takes these on? Who owns the tasks that are set forth here?
Yeah, I think what we heard was a real sensitivity to folks feeling like they've been disproportionately identified as either the salvation or the cause. And so we really called on all Coloradan leaders across the sectors to kind of take up this charge. I think as we look at it, we wanted the governor to, declare that our housing affordability crisis is a state strategic priority. Again, being careful about, kind of virtue signaling, but also, many of us that lead teams know that, folks tend to go the direction of the leadership team. And so we also believe that it's vital that, our Coloradan community members are part of the process because, they're the ones that, are frankly driving decision making. Right, and because we feel duty bound to address their concerns, it really influences our thought-making, our decision-making process. So it really what it comes down to, I think, our local elected officials are entrusted to make decisions on behalf of their communities to allow folks to have a healthy, safe, viable and vibrant life. And so they're going to be at the forefront of it. But we think that there needs to be additional input and engagement from our chambers of commerce, and I know we have representation here, and also kind of this approach towards bringing together market rate developers and affordable housing developers together, frankly, even within both sides, right? So for me, we need folks to say it's not just all multifamily for rental housing or nothing, right? We need to have hybrid solutions where we're providing for sale options, market rate options, and affordable. And hopefully that answers the question.
All right, so she put back up the 7 guiding principles. Nice to see number 5 there because it's not just private sector, right? It's just not private sector, private market.
Yes.
Engagement. It really does take.
Yeah. The way I always do, the way I kind of quick slice that is for me, building affordable housing. I can only really, I have to provide 60 to 80% of the equity in the deal, and then you leave the remainder as debt so that I can keep the rents lower, right? If I'm in the market side, it's inversed, right? And I can service my debt through the pro forma of rents. And so there's no mechanism to accomplish that unless we attack the costs, as we talk about in Telluride, or we use traditional subsidy programs. And when we utilize those, we see them as a tool as opposed to a burden for one subset of the housing development continuum, which is currently what's happening now.
I'm just going to add a kind of tag-on question to that. Peter, you and I were talking just before your presentation. What should be the role of the local housing authority in the provision of affordable housing?
Great question. Thank you for that. For me, I view housing authorities as anchor institutions. We should be a hub of innovation, debate, and discussion. I view us as real estate engines. I am extremely involved in real estate development. And so I am very aggressive when it comes to, buying, entitling, selling land, using the proceeds. We can't, we're straddling 2 sectors as housing authorities, right? None of us receive any sort of line item funding from local governments. And if we do, it's extremely rare. And frankly, we don't really need, it'd be nice, but we can make money as a real estate developer, right? And buy and purchase land, service that, debt, and then have net free cash flow, use that to go. That's what we exist to do. That's exactly what the state legislature created and then empowered local governments to create housing authorities, right? So we can be your fiduciary land agent, right? And so you can have us buy land on your behalf, land bank that. So I think what we need from housing authorities is to be engaged in this conversation, to be able to drive the conversations across the continuum of providers and bridging the divides that, you know, really kind of keep us from getting towards building more housing. So hopefully that answered the question.
And I'll just add, because, you know, with 3,000 public housing authorities across the U.S., not all of them are the same. So, you know, Peter does development. Not all PHAs do development. A lot of them do vouchers or just vouchers. And so I think, you know, absolutely we need to engage them, but you have to look at the community. Not all of them have the bandwidth to do what Maker does in Adams County.
Just a quick question, Laura Nelson with the Apartment Association. Both from Tatiana and from you folks on your research, did you find or do you make any suggestions on how to affect NIMBYism? Just basic, you know, down and dirty, nobody wants it in their backyard, no matter really what it is.
So we looked at that. That's something that we would, you know, define as a high conflict issue. And as Peter likes to say, you know, we're not trying to blame or shame anybody in that. But I think that we also came to the idea that really, you know, a NIMBY one day could be a YIMBY tomorrow. And so it really is not useful to put everybody in these buckets. So, you know, there's different, I think, process improvements that we'd like to include. Everybody needs to be heard, right? That's the point of community engagement. But, you know, one of our guiding principles is be proportional. You know, and Peter can talk a little bit more about it, but there are a lot of studies that say the people who are showing up are there to oppose. But let's engage more in the community. And I think, you know, one of the great things about the pandemic is that we're seeing a lot more engagement through virtual means, and so that means more people can participate and then more voices are heard. I think when we only listen to kind of the opposition, it hurts the conversation. And so really, again, we had these guiding principles so that our leaders can say, okay, you know, let's take a step back. Let's really review what is happening in the community. Is this material? Is this something that is, you know, we should look more into, or do we need to kind of broaden who we're asking and really engage more in the community to see that real kind of sentiment?
Yeah, I think we need to start, like, and that starts by being honest, right? And we're sending a lot of mixed messages. So is it any doubt that Coloradans are feeling, A, this is really scary, and B, you know, this is going to attack my nest egg, right? Like, there's legitimate grievances that we can identify through conversation and I think mitigate, frankly, especially when we look at the proportionality. But, you know, right now, like, we're telling ourselves, like, 40,000 starts a year is a housing boom. It's not a housing boom. Right? A housing boom is what we had once in our history back in '72, and it's really kind of set up, you know, the strong tax base. So if we keep telling Coloradans that, you know, that we can't build, you know, we're building too much, we can't service it with water, we can't, are we surprised when they're saying no? Right? So I think we have to start off, just as we would in any sort of conversation that's culturally based, to say, look, you know, here's the folks coming in, here's what happens if we don't meet those needs, here's how it's impacting you and your loved ones in your community. You're not inherently bad. You are human, you're beautiful, it's understandable, you're going to disagree with me potentially, but I'm a hopeless optimist, and I believe that folks are benevolently flawed, like they don't mean to hurt others. And I think that as we talk through that process and we start to bring the math, we bring the evidence, that we could start to see a sea change of this type of challenge. And again, we look back throughout our history, Americans, you know, we are kind, we are giving, you know, we have the pioneering spirit. We can be, you know, we can be stubborn, but, you know, those are the things that make us great. And if we can come together and do that and treat folks with dignity, warmth, and grace, I think we can start to move the needle that way, and to see folks start to say, okay, I'm all right. I might not trust you yet, but let's see about it. Go ahead. Because what we found, and I know this from a fact from doing this work, is that once the housing goes up, a few years later, nobody's coming back and complaining about it, right? It's that initial fear, which is inherent in all of us. And so that's, I know I'm rambling there, but that's our thought.
We actually thought about incorporating this in our research about going back to projects that had faced a lot of community opposition and going back and interviewing individuals in that community to see kind of what the impact was. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to do it, but you know, it's maybe something we'll take up later on.
We have another question here.
Yeah, the only thing, I think that's a great question, Laura, and you know, at least NIMBY's better than banana, which I think is what, you know, Boulder has, right? Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So, you know, it's a huge problem, but you know, another COVID, I think, silver lining, especially the small business owners going, I can't find labor. And so the awareness is really, really, you know, and then you look at some of the housing statistics, and it's in the media all the time. I would say that probably about 80% of the media inquiries I now have are housing related. So, you know, and then how we spin that is really important, and I mean spin in a good way in terms of educating. It's not really super quick, but it's something that has to happen, and I do think that we're more receptive in this community, believe it or not, than I think a lot of other communities. So anyway.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Beth Rolstad, Executive Director of Homeward Pikes Peak, and we're hopefully groundbreaking on our first LIHTC deal in August. But one of the things that I noticed in our process, which will be 4 years long, maybe even 5 by the time we're having our ribbon cutting, is the pre-development costs. And you didn't really mention that in your presentation, that has become a huge obstacle for us, and we've borrowed approximately $500,000 to get us to this finish line. And thankfully, we do have a partner that's working with us, and we will be getting deferred developer fees to pay that off. But I think of capacity building of other nonprofits, that's a huge barrier. And how can we get through that hurdle to create more affordable housing?
Yeah, congratulations. I know how much time and passion goes into your work, because I live it as well. Yeah, the costs and frankly the sunk costs of pre-development, because you're not guaranteed to get that award, and most likely you're going to have to go in a couple of times. This is why we keep coming back to the value chain, right? So if we can start to expedite those processes, we believe that the overhead will be, you know, kind of incrementally reduced. It could take some time. We have seen investments recently from the state legislature to help with toolkits, but they are predicated, right? The bill I mentioned requires a lot of localities. You have to change 3 things out of a list, and each one of those 3 things is highly contentious to begin with. And so what I think is, but there is an appetite from the state legislature to address what you just described. But if we could move more efficiencies on the front end, it could reduce the amount of overhead on your end. And then we could also ask, you know, perhaps for qualified projects, if the Division of Housing, DOLA, and CHAFA could provide, you know, type of incremental financing or fee-based structures. We looked and we mentioned in the report about how, you know, impact fees that are based by unit as opposed to square footage drives challenging outcomes. As you were talking about that, it just made me think, like, you know, we should be thinking about how we might have a sliding schedule of fees for nonprofits such as yourself that have a viable business plan, have a balance sheet to support and partners and shovel-ready projects, but would need additional help on the front end. And that's something I think that, you know, maybe we can email each other. I'd love to evaluate moving forward, excuse me.
Other questions? I have a question for Tatiana, if nobody has one. Tatiana, you talked about how the economy was looking good in Colorado Springs in terms of recovering from COVID. If we don't really address this housing affordability issue, what impact do you think that will have on our local economy?
Well, I think a lot of the growth that we've had here is because we've been comparatively more affordable. I mean, quite honestly, moved here in 2014, and part of the reason that we moved here as opposed to some of the other, you know, regions that I was willing to move to is I was like, well, there's going to be a lot of growth here. It's still relatively affordable. And, you know, as my chart showed, it's not that we're, you know, terrible at this point in terms of affordability. It's just that the rate of increase in terms of cost of living, especially housing, has really just taken off, right, in the last few years. So My area of expertise is not affordable housing. It's not transportation. I dabble in all of these because they, overlap a lot with economics. But what I do look a ton at and work probably most actively in the community in terms of an economic development perspective is workforce. And we had an issue already with workforce. There's a long list, that I don't even include in my presentation in terms of, why do we have the skills gap? Why are we not letting in as many, educated people legally into the United States, or skilled people? So, it's very complex, but at the end of the day, when people make a decision to move here or stay here, they're going to be looking at that affordability. Wonderful that we're in a high growth state. Fantastic that we're, reaping all the benefits of what is wonderful about Colorado Springs, but you're going to hit a plateau. And the thing that concerns me from a housing affordability perspective is there's kind of no going back. Once you become, unaffordable, it's very difficult. It's just like the wage dilemma right now. Small businesses are saying, oh my gosh, I have to increase my wages to, 20%, 25%. Are they going to decrease them post-COVID? No, those are going to be costs that are going to stay elevated. Well, same thing from an affordability standpoint. Once we are, at a median price of say $550, $600. Now we start seeing that people aren't coming here anymore, or they're even getting up and leaving because they thought they would be able to, stay here, maybe eventually buy a house when they're young renters and so forth. The other thing too is, I showed some information about young people moving here. Wow, what an advantage. And it's not what I heard when I came here. Everyone said, no, it's just, it's basically retirees and military people. Not true. We've had young people moving here for many years, and now it's just really, really taken off in the last few days, or in the last few years. And those are the individuals who we really need to keep. There's a great book if you're ever interested. It's a little dated now, but I read it like 10, 14 years ago, called The Coming Jobs War. Gallup did a great study back before it was even fashionable to talk about workforce shortages. That book is it's only this big, and it tells you all the statistics you ever need to know about how are we going to sustain economic growth. That's true from a national perspective and from a local perspective. And affordability is going to be key. They're going to be city winners and losers. I want us to be a city winner.
On that note, I think that's a great note to finish on, that Colorado Springs should be a city winner. Then I would like to thank very much Tatiana, Peter, and Evelyn for their wonderful presentation, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you.